Welcome to Giving an Answer, the show dedicated to defending the historic Christian faith. I am your host, Dr. H.C. Felder. Today the topic is surviving social theory. And to discuss this with me, I have a special guest, and my special guest is Dianna Newman. Let me tell you about Dianna. Dianna is actually Canadian. She earned an undergraduate degree from the University of Toronto, double majored in psychology and sociology, earned a master's degree in apologetics and the concentration in philosophy from Southern Evangelical Seminary, my alma mater. Mm-hmm. She's traveled nationally and internationally with TEAM, T-E-A-M. I'll let her speak about that in a minute. She speaks on different topics such as the New Age, abortion, knowability of history, Islam, and it goes on and on and on. Welcome to the show, Dianna.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you.
Okay, so let's start out about TEAM, talking about TEAM. What is TEAM?
TEAM, it's an acronym. It stands for Truth, Evangelism, and Apologetics Mission. It's the missions arm of our school, Southern Evangelical Seminary. So it provides students, alumni, and faculty the opportunity to teach. We have women's conferences, we have youth conferences, sometimes we're on university campuses, sometimes it could be a formal debate, it could be just a discussion between two opposing viewpoints. So the work that TEAM does looks quite different, but it's all about articulating and communicating faith in the culture.
Great, great. Okay, now let me set the stage. Normally, when I do a topic, I usually know something about it. I'm not the expert, which is why I'm not sitting in that seat. But I usually have some type of background, some type of a vague general understanding. I have no understanding of this. So my questions may reflect that.
Sure, no problem, no problem.
So let me just start out by asking, how did you get involved in a topic such as social theory?
Social theory. I did my undergrad work in sociology and psychology. And I enjoyed both of those things. I really couldn't decide which one I wanted to do a major in, so I decided to do both of them. But I was confronted with a lot of ideas and theories and philosophies as a Christian student in sociological theory that I hadn't heard about before, that would have been quite antagonistic to maybe someone who wasn't committed to the task of apologetics, which is defending faith. In my sociological theory class, I was confronted with a professor that was openly hostile to Christian faith. And so that created the need for me to reconcile Christianity with sociology. I mean, if Christianity is not true, there'd be no reason for me to continue being a Christian. So the ideas that comprise sociological theory that are very well founded on certain individuals that came out of the Enlightenment period, which we can talk about those individuals later, all of them had something to say about society. Sociology is the study of people.
That was my next question. So what is sociology again?
Sociology is the study of man in institutions. So the study of the relationship between man and social structures, religion, the relationship between man and religion, the relationship between man and just different forces within society that might shape man's thought and ideas.
Is that considered a science?
It is a science. Sociology is a science.
Would a hard scientist consider it a science?
No.
Okay. And when I say hard scientist, I mean someone like a physicist.
No. Well, the empirical sciences are quite unique sciences. So the empirical sciences, biology, chemistry, physics to some extent, they study the natural world as it is.
Right.
But the softer sciences, if you will, psychology and sociology, anthropology, those are more softer in the sense that you are really studying man, and the inner workings of man, if you will, which can't be empirically tested. There are certain psychological truths that empirical studies will never tell you about. There are certain philosophical truths that the empirical sciences will never tell you about, but they're both relevant because we all are aware that we're human beings,
Right.
and we are all engaged and involved and interested in the process of understanding what it means to be human.
Okay, now you also mentioned psychology. So define psychology for us.
Psychology is the study of the soul, very generally speaking. Psyche is a Greek word. So it's the study of the soul, the inner drives, the inner motivations that propel one to act in certain ways. Now, there are certain branches of psychology, very generally speaking. One can study cognitive psychology, social psychology, abnormal psychology. So there are different ways of studying what it means to be human, studying the soul, but very generally speaking, that's what psychology is concerned with.
Okay, so now we define sociology, we define psychology. So what is social theory?
So the sociological theory that's tied to sociology is really tied to, we would call them the sociological fathers, is what we would refer to them as. So when modern society was forming, the Enlightenment period, you had certain things that were happening in the culture that people were trying to put their hands on, trying to get a handle of what's happening in society. For a very long time, religion was the ruler, and religion was the thing that one used to interpret what was happening in society. But when religion was really coming down in terms of its influence and its hold on a people, then another science emerged, sociology, to kind of take the place of religion, to kind of tell us a little bit, okay, about what's happening in society. So in the 19th century, you had people like Max Weber. You had individuals like Sigmund Freud, who is rightly speaking a psychologist, but he's got some overlap with sociology. You have individuals like Karl Marx, Durkheim, Weber. All of these individuals, they were the sociological fathers and put forth certain ideas about what was happening in society, why it was happening.
Okay, so now the reason you know so much about this is because you have written a book by that title, Surviving Social Theory.
Yes.
So is this what your book talks about?
That's what my book speaks about. So when I was a first and second year sociology undergrad student, like I said, I was confronted with a lot of things that were problematic for me. And so what I did was I started writing in the margins of my notebooks, just different things that I didn't necessarily agree with, or different things that I needed to research a little bit more, or different things that I think were necessary for me to have a handle on. And so ultimately, all of those writings in the margins of my textbooks became sociological theory. I wrote it because as a Christian student, Christians are, and students very generally speaking, are exposed to a lot of philosophy in undergrad studies that they don't know is philosophy. Sociology is not sociology as such. Sociology is repackaged philosophy. So it would behoove one who's studying sociology to understand the philosophy that undergirds it. There's a certain philosophy that all of the fathers that I mentioned before came to the table with, and it influenced their sociology, their theory. Now, sociology is not all about theory. The theory is the foundation from which studies are birthed, if you will. So the aspect of sociology that we all know about are those sociological theories where you get samples of people and you do long-range studies and you have control groups and sample groups. That's more applied sociology. That's practical sociology. What I'm concerned with in this book is the theory that undergirds sociology.
So what are some of these theories that you came across?
Well, we can take a look at several of them. So let's start with Sigmund Freud, who was...
Now, are you also going to tell us why you have a problem from a Christian perspective? Or...
From a philosophical perspective.
Okay, that'll
and
work.
Perhaps there might be some overlap.
Okay, that's fine.
So from a philosophical, well, let me just say a little bit about Sigmund Freud first. So he was a psychologist who, I don't know if you've heard anything about psychoanalysis, which is this idea that our repressed thoughts that arise out of traumatic situations can be triggered at any one time if something happens. So, for instance, if a young baby or a young child goes through some type of trauma that's traumatic enough for the mind to repress the trauma of the event, in later life, certain things will happen that might trigger what was repressed earlier. That's basically a rough synopsis of what psychoanalysis is. Sigmund Freud was, he was very much fixated on all things sexual. Sigmund Freud
Yes,
was.
I remember that. I took Psych 101 in undergrad. And
You asked yourself every day, what's wrong with this
yes,
guy?
yes,
Right?
yes,
Yeah, I
yes.
did too. So he was very much centered on sexuality, and he is probably one of the first ones on record that kind of married sexuality with one's human essence. And so his theory of human development was very much predicated on this idea that humans developed according to a certain set of sexual stages. He's just quite interesting, that one. But one of the things that really struck me when I was learning about Sigmund Freud were his ideas about the id, ego,
superego.
and superego,
I still remember those.
and how that relates to the Christian understanding of our conscience,
Right.
you know, and how does that work? Is there any type of overlap, or is Sigmund Freud right and perhaps is the Bible wrong? So I get into that a little bit in the book. I tease out what the similarities are, but I also tease out what the clear differences are as well. Sigmund Freud was an atheist.
Absolutely.
Right, so he was very much committed.
He was not only an atheist. He was, I guess I would say, anti-Christian.
Very anti-Christian. He grew up, his father was, he came from a long line of Jewish rabbis, actually, and many of the sociological fathers are not far removed from having Christian or even theistic influences in their own lives, which leads to another issue. But Sigmund Freud just rejected the Jewish tradition that he grew up with, and as you rightly said, he later became quite anti-Christian, anti-religion, very generally speaking. So in this book, my point is not to say that all of sociological theory should be thrown out. There are some contributions that can be gleaned from all of the theorists. My point is only to say that you have to understand the philosophy that undergirds sociological theory, because a lot of the time in classrooms, sociological theory is presented as tried and true, but it's not. Philosophy is not the type of thing that's tried and true. Philosophy has come to us through thousands of years of discussion on certain things. So I just am encouraging students to think about what it is that they're being taught, and to think about it critically.
Right. So you have Karl Marx. Oh no, first, no, I'm sorry. You did Sigmund Freud, and so let's talk about Karl Marx.
Karl Marx. Karl Marx was another interesting individual. We know Karl Marx as perhaps the forerunner to communism.
Right.
His middle step would rightly be socialism, but his goal was communism after socialism. So Karl Marx is the one that made famous the phrase, "Religion is the opiate of the masses," right? So he was the one he was a critical theorist, and so he was the one to really critique the workings of religion and the workings of society to create a class of workers that were powerless to face their oppressors, who were the rich bourgeois.
So what's the Christian critique of that?
The Christian critique of Karl Marx is not to deny the oppression that he was rightly speaking out against. Karl Marx, again, was an atheist. So my point in Karl Marx is only to say, well, one of the things is to say that as a non-theist, this idea that he could pick out oppression as something objectively troubling, that doesn't make sense. He would have subscribed to some type of evolutionary framework, which is a framework that basically teaches that the fit, those who are fit are the ones who survive, and those who are weak, they get weeded out by the ones who have survived them. So I think there's a certain sense in which Karl Marx's ideas about oppression don't fit the worldview that he was working out of.
Okay. And the last one, like I said, I don't know these people. Well, I know those people.
Karl Marx and
Durkheim. I've never heard that name before.
Durkheim.
So you're going to have to really help me on that one.
Sure. So Durkheim is probably one of the individuals that really put sociology on the map. Sociology in terms of discipline and the disciplines in their ages. Sociology is a young discipline. 1838 is the traditional date that that sociology is attributed with in terms of its birth through Auguste Comte, another individual. But sociology is relatively young as a discipline. And so when Emile Durkheim came on the scene, he was trying to establish it as a legitimate study. So we said before that there's a difference between the empirical sciences and the more softer sciences. Emile Durkheim was concerned with making sociology acceptable to those who thought that the empirical sciences were the best and the only sciences. And so he was the one that really, he did the first legitimate, if you will, sociological study. He did a study on suicide. And he used the principles of sociology to kind of distill this idea that people who were not in close relationships with other people tend to have more higher suicide rates than others. So Emile Durkheim, he was a functionalist. He had a lot of great things to say about society, but where I pick out the difficulty with him is he, as a functionalist, he thought that religion and or God was only useful because it served a certain function in society. So he didn't think that God existed, but he felt like God was a necessary illusion. Believing in God was an illusion that we needed in order for society to carry along as it should carry along. So that's one of the things that I take issue with in the book. The fact that religion might serve a certain function says nothing about whether God exists or not. He can exist, and religion can serve a function too.
I remember when I was in college, and I took a class, what I think most people have taken a class called social studies. Is that the same thing?
Yep, basically.
And the book, I can't remember. I think I remember the book. Oh my goodness.
See,
it was
all
called
coming back.
It was called Man's Worldly Goods. And,
Okay.
And it was a book about the evils of capitalism and feudalism and
Okay.
and it seemed to give really, I remember, I wasn't a Christian at the time, but I remember even then I was thinking, this book is pretty anti-religious. But does that seem to be the case with social studies in general or sociology in general?
Yes, because sociology is predicated on this assumption, this anti-supernatural bias, if you will. Sociology is predicated on this assumption that God does not exist. Sociology comes to us out of the evolutionary framework that was running the institutions in the 19th century, Darwin's framework of evolution, where life started from one common ancestor. Basically, evolution took God out of the equation, if you will. There's no need for God anymore because we can explain the natural world through natural processes. So sociology is built on that idea that evolution is true, and no one really questions that assumption that it's built on. So you will find, very generally speaking, those who are in the social sciences, they proceed their studies on the assumption that God doesn't exist.
And that's really interesting because I know people who are social workers and people who have a heart for other people.
Yeah.
And these people generally care for people, and
Yeah.
I know a number of them who are Christian. But it seems like what you're saying is that the whole idea of sociology in and of itself is anti-Christian. So what would you say to them? It seems like they really need an apologetic.
Well, I think, and this goes back to the applied sociology and the more theoretical sociology. So the things that you mentioned, the social work, as that looks in our culture today, we know what social work looks like. It's the work of people going in to certain contexts and rescuing individuals, if you will. That's what social workers do. There's nothing wrong about that at all. It's really the ideas and the theories. It's much like in feminism, ideas have consequences. So the ideas that started the sociological fathers along the lines of, God does not exist, religion is a creation of powerful people. That's what Marx would say, that the ruling classes create religion, and they create the concept of God so that they can, control those who don't have power. Those sorts of ideas, those are the ideas that are antithetical to Christian faith. I don't necessarily critique the applied sociology. Sociological studies have told us a lot. Long-range studies, short-range studies, control groups, sample groups. They've taught us a lot about human beings and about certain societies and those sorts of things. I don't discount any of those things. It's really the theory that students are confronted with in class that lends itself to the common thread in academia, that God does not exist.
So if someone gets a master's or a PhD in sociology, it'll be difficult for them to get through that with the Christian worldview, wouldn't it?
As a Christian, it would be quite difficult. In fact, my professor, within the first couple days of class when I was an undergrad student, he essentially said that if anyone in the class is a Christian, they probably want to rethink taking sociology, because sociology is quite antithetical to Christian faith. That's what my professor said. So it would be quite problematic. That's not to say that there are not Christian sociologists. There very well are Christian sociologists, but they're the type of sociologists that have critiqued the foundational assumptions of sociology. Once you critique the foundational assumptions, anything going forward can become that much easier.
So what would be your response now to that professor?
I wish I could go back to that class and really have some great discussions with him. But as an undergrad student, and this is another reason why I wrote the book, as an undergrad student, you have no idea what to say to your professors because they're the learned ones and you're kind of just there to study from them. So if I had the ability to go back, I would really engage him on some of the assumptions and claims that he was making.
That is one of the powerful things about apologetics. And one of the powerful things about this show, I'm going to go ahead and say it.
You're right. You're right.
So what else did you cover in your book? What other type of things did you mention?
Well, the book is divided into two parts. And so part one is very apologetic in nature. So I speak about relativism. What is that? I speak about cultural relativism. I speak about this idea of truth. What is truth, and can we know truth? I speak about scientism, this idea that we can only know truth through the sciences. I speak about very apologetic issues in the first part, so that in the second part of the book, when I then begin to talk about the specific individuals, I have a good foundation that's been laid, so I can kind of say, this is Durkheim, he's subscribing to scientism or something like that.
So for those who don't know, what is cultural relativism? 'Cause I imagine that comes up a lot in sociology.
Oh, sure. So I'll say this. So relativism, just by itself, is this idea that there are no objective truths. Everything is relative. So cultural relativism is this idea that there is no objective culture. The truths that a culture imbibes for itself can't be judged as right or wrong because everything is relative from a cultural perspective. Historical relativism, it looks like you take a look at text throughout history and you can't know what anyone was trying to say in the text because everything is relative. So relativism kind of relativizes everything, if you will, and it removes the ability to talk about things objectively. Like Margaret Mead, she was rightly speaking a cultural anthropologist, but she has relevance in sociology as well. So some of the work that Margaret Mead did, she was interested in distilling the absolute and the objective things across all cultures, not what was relative from one culture to the next, but what can we glean from studying as many human societies as possible, and what can we say is objectively true about certain cultures? And so she came up with some really interesting things, but relativism is the denial that that's even possible.
Yeah, and so cultures are not right or wrong, they're just different.
You
right?
can't judge them, they're just different.
No matter what they do.
No matter what they do, according to cultural love.
Even genocide.
Right. It's interesting how people don't take this to its logical extent.
Right.
People aren't willing to perhaps say that there's something quite wrong about Hitler's Germany and something quite good about a society that esteems virtues like love and grace and mercy and all of these different things. Cultural relativism removes your ability to judge as right and wrong.
So, because if cultural relativism is correct, then there is no difference between a Hitler or Mother Teresa, or a society based on the principles of Hitler or the society based on the principles of Mother Teresa.
Absolutely, that's true in theory, but I don't think anyone is a practical cultural relativist. That's impossible. Not even Margaret Mead was a cultural relativist.
So what would you say to that student right now who's just turned the channel and they are going through their sociology book and they're really struggling with their faith, and they turned on Giving an Answer and they're hearing Dianna Newman? What do you have to say to them?
I would say to them that the task of higher education is learning how to take different pieces of information and make it into a unifying whole. So we live in the type of society today where we're getting information from all sorts of people, from all different types of sources, but we haven't found a way how to distill that into something that makes sense. And so as an undergrad student, they are exposed to different ideas and no one brings anything that's unifying to the table. And so for someone who might be a Christian and struggling with the theory, they should pick up my book, and you probably want to read the chapter on Karl Marx, just to give you a different perspective. Whether one agrees with me or not is not really the point, but if you're going to make a choice, then you should be given different choices.
Right. Believe it or not, we're at the end of the show.
Always quick, Harold.
Yes, always quick. Thank you, Dianna Newman, for discussing your book, The Surviving Social Theory.
You are welcome.
And that will end this episode of Giving an Answer. Be sure to join me again next time, and until then, goodbye and God bless. You can find out more about Giving an Answer, as well as listen to other episodes by visiting us online at www.givingananswer.org.